Hi, everyone. Welcome to the AFDB, Everything You Need to Know. AFDB standing for the African Development Bank. So, buckle up for an enlightening and slightly cheeky ride through the corridors of Africa's development future. Today, we're sitting here and we're talking to you, and we're at crucial crossroads, right? And the choices made now would determine whether or not our continent marches forward with pride or stumbles into the same old traps. Picture this: two possible futures lie ahead. One path endorsed by the fossil fuel enthusiasts and their fossilized thinking, seeing African governments following a script written by the global north. And this script is starring extractive industries and colonial powers and has been pulling wealth out of our continent for centuries. It's a plot filled with centralized power, corruption, and large scale energy exclusion. Unfortunately, many African governments are currently caught in this rather grim production. But wait, there's a twist. There's always a twist. Imagine an Africa that flips the script, leapfrogging over fossil fuel-based energy systems to create thriving industrial economies powered by energy access and independence, grounded on renewable energy. This blockbuster pathway nurtures the industries of tomorrow while preserving our environment. It's definitely a story where everyone gets a starring role, especially those who've been sidelined by an exclusionary system. African-led solutions take center stage, lifting socioeconomic prospects for all Africans. Now, this second pathway, ladies and gentlemen, is uncharted, and guess what? The pen is in our hands, and we can write our own development narrative, breaking free from the colonial or neo-colonial, depending on how you want to look at it, structures that have long propped up wealth of the global north. And of course, pursuing this vision won't be a walk in the park. It requires a renewed strategic vision that challenges the old approaches to development, energy, and economics, that prioritizes fossil fuel production and deepen Africa's structural woes, uproots and then also thinking around the strategic vision that uproots the financial and technological dependencies on the global north, ending the era of underdevelopment extractivism, or looking at this strategic vision that reimagines and reorients African institutions to deliver a rapid and just energy transition, building industrial capacity to meet Africa's evolving energy needs. Today, we're definitely going to scrutinize the role of the African Development Bank and how they are aligned to the Paris Agreement alignment. Public money, our money that could be fueling a renewable energy revolution, has been instead been entrenched in some form into a fossil fuel infrastructure and guaranteeing more climatic impacts. We were also going to discuss how the AFDB can fully implement the MDB Paris Alignment Framework and push other multilateral development banks to raise their game. And essentially, where does the African Development Bank fit in terms of this new global financial architecture? And what can we learn from the AFDB's past, and what can be learned from that past to build towards development pathways? So join us as we navigate these crucial topics with a mix of insight and a healthy dose of African pride. Together, let's envision a future where Africa leads its own sustainable development, free from outdated scripts and ready for a blockbuster future. So with me today, I've got an amazing panel of individuals across the globe. And I wanted to literally turn it to Fran Witt, who is from RICOS, who've been supporting Africa really try and understand the theory of change around public finance. And Fran, I was thinking, we've got our listeners here and everyone is thinking we've got the African Development Bank annuals coming up. Why is this important? Why should this be a priority? Why should Africans be using that opportunity as a platform for us to raise our ambitions? And why is it important given the climate emergency? Fran, it's been a pleasure and we cannot wait to hear your input. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dean, for that introduction. And it's a very timely opportunity to be able to think about the African Development Bank and what it does and where it comes from. How much money does it manage and what kind of impact can it have? So I want to give you a bit of a kind of understanding about the nature of the bank that we're talking about and the meetings that are coming up right now. Some of you may know a little bit about the African Development Bank, but basically it's a bank that was set up to promote the economic and social development of African countries through providing financial and technical support. And it was founded in 1964, so it's been around for quite a long time. And it's made up of 3 entities. So there's the African Development Bank itself, which is the main financial institution that provides loans and grants. And then there's the African Development Fund, and this provides concessional funding to low-income countries in Africa. And then there's the Nigeria Trust Fund, which supports development projects in poorer African countries. So as I say, the mission is to spur sustainable economic development and social progress in its regional member countries, thereby reducing poverty. So it was set up with laudable aims. And at this particular, these particular meetings are at a kind of fairly critical juncture for Africa, as we all know. And I think there'll be a number of key issues that will be discussed at these forthcoming meetings, of which the energy strategy is going to be one particularly important pillar. But there will be also a focus on vulnerability to conflict and other issues that will be central to the debate at these meetings, as well as the climate emergency and the energy transition. So the Africa Development Bank is a multilateral development bank. It has 55 members in Africa, but also has 27 non-regional members in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. The structure of the Africa Development Bank is that there's a board of governors, a board of directors, the president, and specific departments which are led by vice president. So the current Africa Development Bank president is President Dr. Adesina, and he was re-elected for his second term in 2020 and will have to hand over his presidency in 2025. So, as I mentioned before, the Africa Development Bank struggled to raise sufficient finance in international capital markets back in the 1970s. And so at that point, it had to open up its membership to countries outside of Africa. And so currently, there are 60% of the members of the Africa Development Bank are based within Africa and 40% outside. And that's quite significant. And the non-regional members include the United States of America, which is the second largest shareholder after Nigeria, and other non-regional shareholders include Japan, Germany, and Canada. So I think it's important to realize that it's not just African nations that are supporting the Africa Development Bank, and in terms of the influence that is had on the Africa Development Bank from the outside, those non-African countries also have the power of veto over decision making. Just to give you a sense of how much finance we're talking about and why it's so important as a lever for change. The Africa Development Bank, as of 2023, has authorized finance of $243 billion. So it's pretty massive amount of finance. And obviously that means it can have an enormous catalyzing impact in the region. And in 2022, their funding approvals reached 8.2 billion just in that 1 year. So the way in which the Africa Development Bank works is through an array of different financial mechanisms and instruments. So it can be through loans, and that's probably the main financial instrument that they use. And they typically use concessional interest rates and long repayment periods. But nevertheless, loans are debt-inducing and can be problematic from that point of view. And they also offer loans through policy-based lending. And then there are a number of other instruments that the Africa Development can use, which is things like equity investments in the private sector or guarantees that offer guarantees to investors and lenders in Africa to mitigate political risk or other forms of risk. And they can de-risk investments from private capital as well. And then there's lending through financial intermediaries, and they can provide financial instruments through commercial banks, private equity funds, or non-bank financial institutions. So there's a range of opportunities at the forthcoming Africa Development Bank meetings to meet with decision makers, both in terms of the governors, the directors, and the staff, and also to try and bring to bear pressure for progressive reform through their different lending instruments, through the loans, equity investments, and lines of credit. So all of these financial instruments can serve diverse functions with varying impacts on energy access and the other goals of sustainable development. And I think one of the things that we're prioritizing at these forthcoming meetings is putting a spotlight on the role of the Africa Development Bank in terms of supporting a sustainable renewable energy transition, and the importance that we place on focusing on that and getting them to stop funding fossil fuels, and particularly gas expansion. So those will be some of the issues that I think we as civil society will be focusing on next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fran, for that. I mean, I kept hearing buzzwords like, loans, African Development Bank, the word development came out so strongly as well. And it got me thinking really around the idea that we've had this institution, for quite some time now in Africa, although not as established as the World Bank, I might say, yes, but they are mandated to tackle poverty and, development holistically across the African continent. Yet we do see Africa embedded within this cycle, of dependency, essentially. And, thinking around the notion around dependency, thinking around the role of the African Development Bank, thinking around the shareholders that you've actually mentioned, thinking around the United States, for example, the biggest polluter across the world, and they're one of the top shareholders in an institution that's African, that is mandated to actually develop the continent, brings about questions around what is the agenda or what is being presented to African that is truly African. Or are we, as my colleague Professor Fadal would say, are we living in a world where we are constantly in structural traps? Because there is a historical debt legacy, right? Africa's debt is the gift that keeps on taking, These loans with terms tougher than a used car dealers have left us in a perpetual cycle of borrowing repayment growth. So who needs it, right? Another structural trap probably is dependency on commodities, or, the idea around extractive industries, or even sovereign debt and conditional loans from different financial institutions, including the AFDB, that come with conditions that would make your utmost strictest teacher proud, right? Austerity measures that cut essential services, stifling growth and increasing poverty. Or even talk about the lack of infrastructure and industrial capacity in terms of it creating this ripple effect where we've got limited access even to global financial markets. And I wanted to bring on Professor Fadel in terms of what do we mean by the mandate of the African Development Bank? What do we mean by these structural traps? And what opportunity exists, and what are the current gaps that currently as well prevail within this whole idea around a reimagined vision for Africa, but bearing in mind that we are in a climate emergency, bearing in mind there is this debt burden, and bearing in mind that we are actually enduring structural traps. Prof. Fadel, over to you.
Hi, Dean. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for hosting this important conversation and for the wonderful introduction. I want to start my answer by reminding us of those colonial traps or colonial role that was imposed on the African continent. And then we can have a conversation about whether or not the African Development Bank has contributed to changing the economic role that the African continent plays in the global economy, and then we'll know if we're making progress or not. So the colonial role that was imposed on the African continent can be summarized in three major points. Number one, we were supposed to play the role of the source of cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of the industrial output from the global north in our large consumer markets. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development and cooperation and job creation. But effectively what it does is that it locks the African continent at the bottom of the global value chain. So that was the role that we played during colonial times. That is unfortunately the role we've played since the era of independence. And this cannot be the role that we play moving forward if we're going to make progress on this continent, whether it's on the economic front or on the climate front. So now the question is, since its creation in the 1960s, did the African Development Bank contribute to decolonizing that traditional role or not? And unfortunately, my assessment is that it hasn't. It played sort of a similar role as all the major international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions. And I can give you specific examples so that we are clear about what has been done in the past to reinforce those colonial traps. And maybe that gives us also a sense of direction in terms of what can the African Development Bank do to really transform the continent. So when we talk about structural traps that are kind of the appearance of these structural traps is, of course, is the external debt that hasn't gone away, and it keeps getting most of our countries entrapped every few years. The source of external debt can be summarized in three major categories. Number one, it's food imports. Number two, it's energy imports. And number three is value added deficits. So when I talk about food deficits, according to UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, Africa today imports 85% of its food, when during colonial times we used to be the breadbasket of colonial powers. And that entrapment didn't happen by accident, it happened by design. As soon as we started gaining independence, the rules of international trade, especially when it comes to agriculture, have forced us into this situation where we become the continent that produces what we don't consume and consumes what we don't produce. We've been forced into the role of exporters of cash crops, coffee, tea, tobacco, bananas, and the like. And then we import the core crops such as wheat and rice and maize and corn and so on. So that is the food deficit trap. So now when we zoom in and say, well, did multilateral development banks, whether it's the World Bank or the African Development Bank, did it contribute to this entrapment, the fact that we've lost our food sovereignty? And the answer is yes. And the answer today in 2024 is still yes. I'll give you an example. if a country is in a debt trap, its entire economic thinking is rewired to prioritize economic activity that generate dollar revenues, because we need those dollar revenues to service the debt. We need those dollar revenues to feed the population, to import the wheat and rice and corn that we need for our nutrition. So now, if a project is presented to the African Development Bank to be financed, they will look at it and they will assess whether it's bankable or not, whether it will actually, be a project that will be economically successful to generate the revenues, to pay back the loan, and to sustain itself. And that means if we're investing in a project that will increase a country's food sovereignty and food security in the common sense of the term, that is, producing wheat or rice for the nation, that will not be perceived as a bankable project. Why? Because you need to import fertilizers, you need to import pesticides, and then whatever you're producing, you're selling it in the local market, in the local currency. You're not exporting it to generate dollar revenues. So that project gets dismissed. Instead, the project that will get funded is a project that will say, we're going to export bananas or coffee or tea or tobacco or flowers, cut flowers for exports. That project gets funded. Why? Because it will generate dollar revenues. But that project is literally draining the country of its resources and is not providing the food security that is actually needed in terms of producing wheat or rice or corn. So that is, unfortunately, that has been part of the problem of all multilateral development banks, including the African Development Bank. Now, the second structural trap that I mentioned is energy deficits. And that is, when I say energy deficits, I include a country like Nigeria. Our biggest oil exporter on the continent is energy insecure, is energy poor. Nigeria today imports 100% of its gasoline from international markets. Angola, our second largest exporter of oil, imports 80% of its fuel from international market. And that is part of the economic entrapment of the fossil fuel industry that has happened country by country across the continent. Now, given our biggest energy potential on this continent, which is renewables, according to the International Energy Agency, the biggest potential for Africa is renewables. Africa, by 2040, with existing renewable energy technology, can produce 1,000 times its energy needs. Now, does the African Development Bank prioritize financing the manufacturing and deployment of renewable energy infrastructure on the continent, or instead financing more fossil fuel entrapment? That is a very clear lens for us to, assess the performance of our development bank on this continent. And then finally, the third structural trap is the kind of manufacturing that we were allowed to have on this continent. And I underline that we are allowed to have on this continent is the kind of manufacturing where we have to import the machines, we have to import the fuel to power the factories, we have to import the intermediate components to assemble with low-cost labor, and we even have to import the packaging. So what we produce with the kind of manufacturing base that we have has low value-added content. And what we import from outside the continent is high value-added content. So with that kind of manufacturing deficit, value-added deficit, you can double, triple, quadruple your exports, and you're still locked at the bottom of the value chain. So the question becomes for us, when our African Development Bank says we're going to go into this green industrialization that everybody's talking about, the question is, what kind of green industrialization? Is it the same industrialization, quote unquote, that we've used in the past, where we're locked at the bottom of the value chain, where we're producing low value added, except now it's with green energy, supposedly? In that case, that will be greenwash, rinse and repeat, the same colonial trap. Or are we truly talking about green industrialization that will not only use our biggest potential, the green energy that we have on this continent, to manufacture and deploy high value added content for deployment on the continent, and then for exporting the surplus? That becomes the lens through which we assess the performance of AFDB in the past in terms of financing, manufacturing, and industrialization. And that's also the lens we use moving forward. So my personal assessment of the performance of our African Development Bank is, unfortunately, overall not decolonizing the structural traps that I was discussing here, but unfortunately reinforcing and accelerating the structural traps, which is why the debt crisis hasn't gone away, which is why we haven't really seen substantial development and improvement in quality of life to the fullest potential that we have on this continent. We have the potential to be the economic powerhouse of the global economy, and yet we're trapped in all the structural traps that I discussed, including the debt trap and the poverty trap, and so on. So that's kind of the initial assessment I would put on the table for us to consider. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fadel. That's insightful. Scary to say the very least. You used words like, you used the words like decolonize. I'm thinking, in order for Africa to decolonize, we also need to decarbonize. And when I'm thinking of this word, I'm thinking of bringing in Courtney, right, essentially into the conversation, because you also used the word assessment. And, some people may say that, the African Development Bank plays a curious game of balancing hope and bureaucracy. On paper, their mission to foster sustainable economic growth is noble. In reality, the execution sometimes feels like a comedy of errors. Maybe, right? I mean, picture Ernst officials in crisp suits navigating a labyrinth of paperwork where progress reports multiply faster than actual projects, right? And the bank boasts of grand initiatives, yet there are potholes that persist and power shortages prevail. And some people have said, the AFDB stands for always discussing, barely doing. And still, beyond that, there's still a flicker of optimism that maybe, just maybe, they'll get it right. And maybe Courtney might tell us more, because she is from the African Climate Reality Project, and they're part of the Fair Finance Southern African Coalition, and they put the bank to test. They implemented a methodology. They did a big assessment of the African Development Bank amongst other financial institutions across the African continent. Courtney, do you mind explaining briefly about the methodology and why you do these assessments, and really what were the results of the AFDB in terms of climate change and the relevant topics that are critical for Africa's development pathway?
Sure. Thank you, Dean, for that intro, and hi, everybody. And thanks to the other speakers as well. I'm learning a lot of insights as well. So yeah, I just wanted to speak to you a bit about one of our foundational pieces of work we do as part of the Fair Finance Coalition, which are essentially policy assessments. We do them every second year, and we focus particularly on public finance institutions. And of course, the African Development Bank is one of the biggest ones we assess. As Dean mentioned, we follow a methodology that was developed by Fair Finance International over the last couple of years, which is essentially used to rank and assess publicly available policies of various institutions. So we, as I said, focus on public finance institutions, but it is possible to use the methodology to also assess private institutions. It's based on international standards when it comes to environmental, sustainability, and human rights issues. Now, the reason we do these assessments is to firstly evaluate the extent to which policies of public finance institutions comply with relevant international standards, right? But secondly, we also use this assessment strategically to actually open up dialogue and engagement between civil society and public finance institutions. And the assessment really provides us a fact-based report or document that we can use to urge the PFIs and to talk to them, engage them, to really push them to adopt more responsible and sustainable investments and financing deals. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the methodology because it's very tedious, but it's something that we do every second year. But essentially, the PFIs are scored on a scale of 0 to 10 under a number of themes. So, for example, climate change, transparency and accountability, but also corruption, human rights, for example. A score of 0 means that the bank does not have any policy publicly available on this particular theme. And then a score of 10, obviously being that there is a policy and this policy is excellent and it meets all the requirements laid out in the methodology. And just to say once again, we only assess public policy. So anything that the bank claims to have behind the scenes, we don't take that into account at all. And so I'm just going to take you through the some of the results of the AFDB from our last assessment, which was done in 2022. And so these are policies only published before June 2022. So as Dean said, we assessed 6 public finance institutions. And overall, actually, across all the institutions, they scored worst on climate change and transparency and accountability. And then coming in third and fourth was gender and power generation. So as you can understand, those are 4 of the biggest issues we have on the African continent. And so really disappointing that our financial institutions scored so badly in these themes, but not surprising. None of the banks, including the African Development Bank, disclose any kind of concrete plans to phase out fossil fuels in financing and investments. Across all the themes, the African Development Bank scored a overall score of 6 out of 10, right? So that's a 60%. And for a bank that's one of the biggest investors on the continent and holds so much power in terms of shaping the future that we want in Africa, 60% is really not promising at all. Notably, under the climate change theme, the African Development Bank scored a 1.7 out of 10, which is dismal, and a 4 for transparency and accountability, with a 4.1 for gender equality. So as you can see, those 3 really important themes, climate change, transparency, and gender equality, the bank scores below average, and in climate change, 1.7 out of 10 is quite disappointing. So just to delve a bit deeper into some of the results, for climate change, the points received are for its integrated safeguard system and operational safeguards. And while some of us may know, these policies do mention environmental impacts of some investments, the score is so low here because the bank does not provide a clear strategy that details how and when it will phase out fossil fuel financing, and doesn't make mention of attempting to align with the Paris Agreement. So this means, there's no kind of timelines, there's no strategy, there's no action plan for this. Moving on to power generation, the bank scores an average score of 5.5, because, as we know, it does fund renewable energy on the continent to some extent. But again, the fact that there's no plan to actually phase out fossil fuel financing does reduce their score. And as we know, of course, we have to be reducing and phasing out financing for fossil fuel while increasing finance for renewable energy. We can't just be increasing both of these things. The bank really doesn't provide any kind of measurable target for reducing emissions in line with the Paris Agreement in its internal processes, in its finances, or in investment portfolios. In 2019, the bank announced, as some of us may remember, that it was going to, I quote, get out of coal. But as many of us have been waiting, there's still not really been an update to the energy policy that actually puts on paper and institutionalizes this commitment. And generally, we know that the African Development Bank is pretty good at saying the right thing at the right time. They come out with these statements just before the AGM or just before COP, but they're not so good with implementation. They're not so good with timelines or follow through, really. So there are some strategies, Green Growth Strategy Framework from 2020, for example, that mentions that the bank will cease investments in coal, but again, no timeline, no detail provided, and so the scores are quite low when it comes to those policies. And now if we look at the transparency and accountability score, although the bank does disclose some information on some of its projects, allowing for a score of 4.4, there's actually no plan or outline in a policy that speaks to how they respond to companies or clients where there are negative social or environmental impacts of projects after the deal, after the financing has been provided, right? So that speaks to lack of accountability for projects. And I think we might hear a bit more about a project later on. I'm not going to go into detail about all of the scores. They are available in a report that I can, we can circulate the link. But overall, what we'd say is that the African Development Bank really lacks detail and timeline in its policies, and can really, how we see it, play a better role on the continent in providing some kind of leadership for African PFIs by really strengthening its policies and particularly its climate change policies really need to be improved. Our short recommendations that come out of this report to PFIs in general, but specifically the African Development Bank, is firstly to establish a fossil fuel finance exclusion plan with clear timelines and targets. Secondly, to align with the 1.5 Paris Agreement target by establishing and disclosing measurable targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, operationally, financing, and investment portfolios. Third, to improve the level of disclosure and sustainability across the themes. Fourth, to disclose the scope and content of existing and future policies. And what we mean by scope is that even if something is mentioned in a policy, we need to know whether that applies to the investment portfolio, the financing portfolio, or different funds that the bank controls, right? So we need to know how far does this policy really go. And then finally, to really strengthen engagement with civil society organizations who have done some of this work, right, including the Fair Finance Coalition, who can give more advice on how to improve your score, but also with other organizations that are also speakers in the space, who have expertise to offer and can really link up the bank with what's really happening on the ground. Just to say, this year, 2024, is a policy assessment year for us, and we will be updating these scores in the coming year, and hopefully by October we will have a new report just in time for COP, and we'll be able to engage the bank and engage other CSOs on this. And then lastly, to say, policy assessments are a really great way to learn a bit more about the ins and outs of an institution, but it really does not tell the whole story. And you have to be able to read a policy assessment in parallel with case studies. And we need to understand that even if a bank does have a really good policy, a detailed policy, that's not necessarily what's happening on the ground. So yeah, just to say, case studies, lived experience, everything that's happening on the ground really tells a real story of what the bank is doing in Africa. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that from other speakers. Thanks, Dean.
Thank you so much, Courtney, for that very, very insightful policy assessment. So I guess we can mark the bank down, hopefully, with that assessment. But let's get more insights, right? I don't want to conclude and be like the AFDB saga continues and it's a curious blend of ambition and absurdity. But we could hear from Zara, from the Center of Environmental Rights, who has a few, projects that she could talk about that the AFDB have implemented, particularly from a South African perspective. And maybe we can come to a small conclusion towards the end in terms of how well the AFDB is doing in Africa. Zara, over to you.
Thanks, Dean. Hi, everyone. So as Courtney mentioned, the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa have had their eye on the AFDB for quite a few years now. And the point that we really like to drive home is that development finance institutions like the AFDB are set up for a specific purpose. And unlike commercial banks, they do have a particular mandate to advance sustainable economic development for the countries they operate in. And the AFDB is no different. It has a clear mandate. It has to contribute to sustainable economic development and social progress, as it says. So I think in order for the AFDB to really take this mandate seriously, they need to consider whether continuing to finance fossil fuels, for example, gas, is furthering or hindering sustainable economic development on the continent, the Sustainable Development Goals more broadly, and also global climate goals. And I think the AFDB's upcoming annuals is a key opportunity for the government structures of the bank to really rethink how finance is being channeled for development on the continent. And I saw that a priority item on the agenda for this year's annuals is reforming the global financial architecture. And I really think the bank must be commended for its work in addressing that. But at the same time, I think that any financing that comes from other multilateral development banks like the IFC or any other financing mechanism must really be used in a way that promotes sustainable economic development. And when we say sustainable, we really need to unpack what that means on a practical level. And that really means it must be environmentally, socially, and economically logical and sustainable on the ground. And I'll unpack what that means when it comes to gas financing, but maybe to just look at an existing example of what the AFDB has financed in South Africa so far. If we look at the biggest loan that the African Development Bank has ever approved, and also its biggest project in South Africa, it's the Medupi coal-fired power station, which is the fourth largest coal-fired power plant in the world. And that's powered by Eskom, which is South Africa's state power utility. And the African Development Bank financed that for $2.2 billion US dollars. Not only the African Development Bank, but also the New Development Bank and the World Bank also contributed to the power plant, and particularly for flue gas desulfurization technology, which is supposed to reduce the pollution at the plant. Now, up until today, that technology has still not been implemented, even though the financing was provided maybe more than 10 years ago. Eskom has also continuously failed to meet the national pollution standards for that power plant, and yet more and more financing was given for it. Also, the Fair Finance Coalition did a study last year that showed the actual lived reality of the people surrounding the power station. And it really paints a grim picture of the kind of environmental and human rights violations that are associated with such mega projects that are often financed by DFI, such as the African Development Bank. So that's just an example of the kind of socioeconomic impacts that such projects have. And I don't think gas will be any different. If we have to look at the economic side of financing gas, a report by All Change International last year, I think, found that 66% of oil and gas extraction on the continent, and this includes both existing and developing gas projects, is actually owned by corporations headquartered overseas, outside of Africa. So what that really means is the money is flowing outside of the continent. So we really need to be asking who is benefiting from something like gas production. And then another point is that a lot of the planned gas projects for the continent are actually for export. So 93% of the existing operating liquefied natural gas, LNG, projects on the continent are for export, and 84% of the planned or under construction LNG projects are intended for export. So that's just some of the numbers to give you an idea. It also doesn't make sense when we've got least cost options such as renewables. And Africa really has so much untapped potential when it comes to renewable energy. So that's the economic side. And then if we look at the climate side, I think it's quite obvious that Africa is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The continent is warming faster than any other continent. And on top of it, we've got poverty and inequality to deal with. And so the impacts of more fossil fuel production will really exacerbate all those impacts. And I think developing new gas and expanding existing gas production is not in line with reaching our goals in terms of the Paris Agreement. There's also those international obligations to think about. And then so it really doesn't make sense from an environmental or economic perspective to be financing gas. Thanks, Dean.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that. Great insights around the dangers. I mean, that Medupi power plant, if memory serves me right, like you said, lots of money was pumped in. And I think it took like just under 5 days for it to go offline again, and it cost an additional 2.5 billion to put it back online. So money wasted, years wasted. A lot needs to go into how we want to understand how these policies need to be implemented, or even the value of a fossil fuel finance exclusion policy. And maybe just quickly, just bring back Fran in terms of like what do we mean by, fossil fuel finance exclusion policy? I mean, Fadel mentioned it, Courtney mentioned it, Sarah mentioned it. What do we mean, Fran, by we say fossil fuel finance exclusion policy from the FDB side? And while we wait for Fran, I will urge everyone who's on this call, please do comment on this live thread so that we may ideally address any comments that you may have, and then we can take it forward. Fran, are you with us? If not, we can get back to that question a little bit later. Fran, you're here. There we go.
I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Yes, so I think when we're talking about a fossil fuel finance exclusion policy, we're talking about a policy that excludes all finance for oil, coal, and gas. But it's not just direct finance. It's not just finance that is going direct to specific projects. It's other kinds of support that the Africa Development Bank continues to give, which includes things like indirect finance through development policy loans, or public finance to governments, which enables gas expansion through policy support, or technical assistance. So many of the instruments that the Africa Development Bank uses to support the energy transition also use technical assistance, and sometimes technical assistance can also be used to support the expansion of gas and LNG. So again, it's kind of a hidden form of support. It's not necessarily huge amounts of money, but it can have a disproportionate impact on policy, as well as how it facilitates private finance. And I think the other instrument, a really important instrument, is lending through financial intermediaries, which is basically through private banks. And again, once the money from the Africa Development Bank has gone through a financial intermediary, it becomes very difficult to trace. And we've seen instances where finance has gone to support the expansion of fossil fuels through financial intermediaries as well. So we're wanting a fossil fuel exclusion policy, mainly because the Africa Development Bank ought to be about development and about empowering Africa to tackle its poverty, but also become economically successful. To do that, it needs to be supporting the continent to transition much more rapidly to energy security, and that includes or involves transitioning to sustainable renewables. And it's part of a sort of wider Paris alignment effort as well. So the AFDB needs to be thinking about how it adequately aligns with the Paris Agreement, and not just the kind of not just the sort of top level goals, but actually meaningfully address the climate crisis as well as the energy transition. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I mean, it's a pretty bleak picture, right, in terms of where we are at, given, like what Courtney said earlier on, 2019, coal didn't have a role to play, but we haven't had an energy policy review that actually reflects that kind of declaration. now there's this whole notion around gas as a transition fuel, if we're building towards a future of renewable energy. So we see a little bit more of the financing coming into gas in comparison to the actual renewable energy. Some may say that it's financial fraud, and I'd like Fidel to explain that. What do we mean by individuals that actually invest in gas projects are committing financial fraud, Fidel?
Thanks, Dean. It's actually, about taking the economics seriously and taking the science seriously. So if we take the economics seriously, and if financial institutions like AFDB do their due diligence in assessing the risk involved in investing in fossil fuel infrastructure, what we know from the work of the recent report, last year's report from the International Energy Agency, is that global demand for fossil fuels, all categories of fossil fuels, is stalling and is going to decline in the next few years. Meaning that when we put money on the table to build fossil fuel infrastructure that are supposed to last 30 to 50 years, infrastructure that are supposed to generate return on investment to the original investors over the next 30 to 40 years, that means that the demand for those sources of energy, for fossil fuel, needs to be sustained. But we know the fact that the demand is going to decline, which means those investments will become stranded assets, physical stranded assets and financial stranded assets. And if we take the science seriously simultaneously, the science from the IPCC report and so on, knowing that we are on track currently with existing infrastructure to extract and burn twice as much as we're allowed to by 2030, by 2040, which means the science is telling us we need to not only stop adding additional fossil fuel infrastructure, but we need to rapidly phase out fossil fuel sources and under a just transition framework. So if we take the economics seriously and the science seriously, then every single dollar that is invested in new fossil fuel infrastructure on this continent has got to mean one of two things. It's either signing our collective suicide pact, knowing what the consequences are for continuing to extract and burn fossil fuels, or it's committing financial fraud by duping investors into putting money on the table, investing in infrastructure that will become stranded physical infrastructure and stranded physical assets. And that means whether it's a collective suicide pact or financial fraud, it's criminal and it needs to be treated accordingly. And that's the call that I personally have for managers and leaders of the African Development Bank to seriously reconsider the work that they're doing in the energy sector, the contributions that they're putting on the table in the energy sector, and to not turn a blind eye, because this is what they're doing. Not turn a blind eye on the fact that the biggest money to be made, the biggest potential for the continent, the biggest economic opportunities are in the renewable energy sector. And that is the due diligence we demand of our African Development Bank. Thanks. Over to you, Dean.
Thanks, Fidel. I mean, you just mentioned renewable energy. Everyone's mentioned renewable energy. I mentioned renewable energy as well. And the AFDB has invested in a renewable energy project in Kenya, right? Northern Kenya, in Turkana. Omar, do you want to explain that project a little bit? I'm going to get back to you again, Omar, later on, because there's something special that I want to highlight for you. But I wanted you to shed light in terms of the renewable energy project that was implemented by the African Development Bank in the northern part of Kenya, particularly because it's very important, right? Because we're talking about just transition, we're talking about financing the future. But what did that future actually look like without the just part in it? Over to you, Omar.
Yeah, it's a great question, and ideally it's one of the things that were sort of we did not expect, because for a long time, as civil society and as people of the continent, we were pushing for renewable energy, but we really didn't take or spend more time to think about what that should look like. And therefore, what happened with the Electoral Turkana case is the largest wind plant in Africa, over 300 megawatts of electricity through wind, onshore wind in Lodwar near Turkana, where it was proposed as a renewable energy project that's going to provide cheap electricity for the country. But the way that it was approached and how it was implemented was done in a way that it was not very consultative of the communities, ended up displacing a lot of communities within the Lodwar region. And we actually had, I think, several cases that were filed in court in terms of challenging that project. So even when we're talking about renewable energy, it has to be people-centered, and it has to be about providing that energy first to these people that are living closest to the project, and not necessarily about getting that energy. And the first thing we're thinking about for the electricity is how we can get it closer to the urban centers and maybe to the nearer, richer regions, while communities are being displaced. That's, in a nutshell, is what the project is about. There was also the question about how those tenders were issued. There's many questions in terms of we might not have gotten the best deal in terms of how much tariffs we were paying for the project. And even recently, there was a huge scandal in terms of the project proponents being paid more than they should. And actually, the audits were saying that some of that money had to be sent back to our country. So there are all these different layers of issues that are happening on it, so that even a project that's coming with this beautiful and flowery language as renewable energy ends up not necessarily helping the community and the country, but actually continuing to propel, corporate profits and corporate greed.
Thank you so much, Omar, for that insight. I mean, the words that are screaming out of my mind now is free, prior, and informed consent. And Zara, I know you're a lawyer with Center for Environmental Rights. What is the importance around this notion around free, prior, and informed consent, particularly for looking at it from a just transition perspective? Why is it important, legally speaking?
Thanks, Dean. I think the importance of FPIC, as they call it, is really to take into account, firstly, having consent of the communities that are going to be impacted the most by a project. And not that means not only environmental impacts, like, for example, air and water pollution, but also beyond that. So there's human rights impacts at stake. As it was shown in our Medupi case study, there was a study done which a couple of years ago by a scientific institution that said that if the Medupi power station continued to run without the necessary technology to reduce the pollution, it would cause approximately 90 deaths per year. So really doing a project without the consent of the communities most impacted and without consulting them is a grave violation of their environmental and human rights.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. I mean, this speaks towards why it's very important to use these upcoming annual meetings to not only just push for this transition, but the justice aspect of it, but at the same time holding the bank accountable to be transparent, to be inclusive, to be consultative, and goes beyond just the individuals, right, in the CSO space, in the NGO space, but also the frontline communities who bear the brunt of the climate crisis, who bear the brunt of these various projects across the African continent. So it does give us a moment to all come together. And I wanted to invite Omar to really explain why the 25th of May, 2 days right before the annuals kick off, is important and is an important moment for everyone that's going to be in Nairobi in terms of the march for economic liberation. Omar?
Thanks, Dean. I definitely will be speaking about that in a bit, but I wanted to begin by mentioning that you've all heard, from the speakers, Professor Fadel, Zara, and everyone else who's spoken, in terms of, when the AFDB was formed, the many tragedies that we're facing. But I wanted to begin by mentioning that if you look at the Africa Development Bank website and you look at the mission and strategy, you'll see that they want to deal with 5 key strategic priorities. And I'm mentioning this because it's really important as a beginning point to get to the mobilization and why it's important. First priority within the strategies that they have, the key strategic priorities, is to feed Africa. And you all heard that the FDB was founded in 1964. When it was founded, Africa was feeding itself. Right now, over 85% of the food that's consumed in Africa has to be imported from out of the continent. So, are they doing what they were founded to do? Definitely not. The other key strategic priority that they have is to light up and power Africa. And you all heard about how over 600 million Africans are energy poor. And since 1964 to date, that figures don't seem to be improving. And the only solution that AFDB is selling to us is that gas is the transition fuel, when actually that gas is actually for export to the global north and other countries out of the continent. They're talking about industrialization as a key strategic priority. Fadel has told you about how the only industry that we have within the continent is more bottom and of the value chain sort of industrialization. It's mostly just to extract these raw materials and take them to the global north and then importing them back in Africa as very, very expensive products. It's true for oil in Nigeria, in Angola, in Algeria, and other countries. It's true for gas, and it's also going to be true for the critical minerals if we don't move away from the current modus operandi. And then the other two is to integrate Africa, and then lastly, to improve the quality of life of the people of Africa, which definitely is not happening. Now, for all of you that are listening, we normally have, this habit of saying mobilization, marches, people doing stuff to sort of bring out their issues and their voices around some of these wrongdoings that are happening for the continent. It's left for civil society organizations, or key, community affected people. But that's not really true because, these impacts are affecting all of us in the different professions, the different places, geographies, and where we are. And therefore, this is important because, I'm a follower of some of the key Pan-Africanists that we've had within the continent, talking about people like, Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara. But today I want to speak about one key Pan-Africanist from Sudan. His name is Tajuddin Abdurrahim. And one of the things that he always kept saying was that we need to stop agonizing and we need to start organizing.